Okay, guys, welcome back for Collapse at the Center, World War, Depression, and the Rebalancing of Global Power, 1914 to the 1970s. And now we're going to focus on capitalism unraveling the Great Depression. This is another long section, but please bear with me. It's important to examine the history of Europe between 1914 and the 1970s as an organic whole, made up of all of these closely interconnected parts, and considering the repercussions of nationalism and colonialism in Europe and Japan, because we need to increase your awareness of the effects of two world wars. So imagine the appeal of totalitarian movements in the 20th century as we go through this, and like I said, just bear with me through another long section. Okay, the Great Depression represented the most influential post-war change. It was suggested that Europe's economy was failing. There were worries about industrial capitalism and what that meant. It had generated individualist materialism. It created enormous social inequalities. Its instability caused great anxiety amongst large populations. And thus the Great Depression hit in 1929. Contracting stock prices wiped out paper fortunes. Many lost their life savings, and the world trade dropped 62% within a few years. And businesses contracted, got smaller, some completely shut down. Unemployment soared, got up to nearly 25% in the United States alone. It reached 30% in Germany by 1932. So prior to the Great Depression, let's look at capitalism's mixed track record. Prior to the Great Depression, capitalism had a mixed record. While it created the world's most impressive period of growth, wealth was far from evenly distributed, and many saw the new culture of capitalism as a threat to their core values. And various socialist movements critiqued capitalism and its social injustices. Now, there were numerous causes that contributed to the Great Depression. The American economy was booming in the 1920s. By the end of the decade, factories and farms produced more goods than could be sold. And Europe was impoverished by World War I. It didn't purchase many American products. So as Europe was recovering, it had to produce more of its own goods as opposed to purchasing American goods. And so the stock market crash of 1929 shocked many as paper fortunes were lost in a day. There were reports of 11 suicides on Wall Street by high-ranking investors. The sudden crash seemed as if the whole system was rapidly coming apart, and that scared and threatened many. Considering the generations of growth to this point, this was all the more stunning. Now, there was speculative stock market that had driven stock prices up artificially high, and that was a large portion. Okay, let's look at this image. Who are the people in the front of the billboard? Well, they're standing there in line. These are actually flood victims from a flood in Louisville, Kentucky in 1937, waiting for food from a charity or some type of public welfare organization. And still in the midst of the Great Depression, these people were left with few other options. And look at the billboard that they're standing in front of. What does that advertise? It shows a happy white family of four with a small little dog driving a car, seemingly into a better future and a better life. And this poster declares it's the American way, providing Americans with the idea that the world's highest standard of living exists here. But it paints a very different picture and an image with those standing in front of the billboard. So what meaning did the billboard intend to deliver, and how did the photographer change that message? Well, the billboard was intended to restore the confidence of American consumers and to assure them that even in 1937, better times had indeed arrived. And the red line in the front of the billboard actually underscores or undermines that claim. What's more, the striking color contrast between the white family and the poor African Americans standing below them make it clear that the bitter truth that the poverty of African Americans had never been a concern of the white mainstream, and that recovery was going to come to white Americans first, unfortunately. Okay, and here we have a chart showing the percentages of unemployment among the active populations in the United States, Germany, and Great Britain, all represented by a different color. And this, I think a line graph is an excellent method to show the unemployment rates during the Great Depression. And you could see how up and down a lot of this is. Right here's the stock market crash of 1929 and the significant increase in unemployment rates. And it takes, it goes down in Germany fairly quickly, and there's a good reason for that, and we'll get into that, World War II. And it levels off decently in Great Britain, but it hits Americans fairly hard. Okay, let's look at these worldwide empires. The worldwide empires made the Great Depression a worldwide problem. It essentially was just an American problem, but because of its far-reaching into many parts of the world, it became a worldwide problem. And countries or colonies were dependent on the export of a few products, and they were hit pretty hard. And tensions in Latin America frequently resulted in military takeovers, interventionist governments, import substitution, industrialization, and even authoritarian and populist politics, as people were looking for an answer. As the industrial economies could no longer afford to use the raw materials from the rest of the world, like rubber and oils and supplies of food like coffee and cocoa, the crisis was quickly globalized, putting farmers, miners, plantation workers in colonies in Latin America essentially out of business. And the Depression saw the rise of military-backed authoritarian regimes in Latin America that pursued policies of industrializing in one sector to substitute for importing specific products. Now, while this created some economic growth, it also set the pattern for military authoritarian regimes ruling in the region, and we see that pattern throughout the next several decades. And in Europe, several states turned towards increased government intervention in the economy with social democracy. In the United States, under President Roosevelt, enacted the New Deal, a Keynesian program of government spending, and that's a pretty famous economist. Okay, so the Depression was a major challenge to governments. The capitalist governments had thought that the economy would regulate itself, and the Soviet Union's economy had grown throughout the 1930s, which was also a scary thought to many. And in response, some states turned to democratic socialism. That's what I was talking about earlier, with greater regulation of the economy and more equal distribution of wealth. And thus we see the New Deal. Roughly 1933, 1942, Franklin Roosevelt's administration launched a rather complex series of reforms in hopes to get the United States out of the Depression, heavily influenced by the British economist John Maynard Keynes. And Roosevelt's public spending programs permanently changed the relationship between the government, the private economy, and individual citizens. Previously, it had been a laissez-faire policy, very hands-off for the government. Many believe that with capitalism, that was the more appropriate approach. And so there was very little regulation in the free enterprise system. But Roosevelt's public spending programs changed that. Governments became heavily involved in the private economy and in individual citizens and what was produced and what was purchased. And some believe that it worked, some believe that it didn't work. And essentially it didn't work as well as I think Roosevelt had hoped. The U.S. economy only improved with massive government spending, and that was because of World War II. And Nazi Germany and Japan actually were the ones that coped with the Depression the best. And now I have a series of images that I think is important for you to see, all in reference to the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl in the Great Plains. Here is a truck. Can't even see in the background. The dust is so high and so thick. This would be in the early mid-30s. And in some cases completely blacked out the sky and the sun. as you can see here, just rolling over the Great Plains. And that's what it looks like when the dust settles. Some places were, excuse me, not places, some equipment and tools were completely covered, while others you could at least get through a door or a window. But you can see here the wheels, and this is completely covered in sand and dust. Here's a car, right, that's half of it's buried. Probably can no longer function. And here you can see with the uplift of wind from the dust up pretty high. This one's all the way up to a window covering the door here. Love this one. This is at noon in the beginning of April 1935 in Dodge City, Kansas, which is the southwestern part of Kansas. And that says herrings, I think, maybe something shop. But that's at noon. That's how dark it was with the amount of dust and sand in the air. And this is a great map that shows the hardest hit areas of the Dust Bowl, right smack dab in the middle of the Depression. It may have been the roaring 20s, but it was definitely the dirty 30s. And this right here is probably one of the most famous pictures of the 1930s and the Great Depression. It's a mom with several children. She's holding one right here. Two are with her right there. And I believe at this point in time when this picture was taken, and actually it was taken by a photographer hired by President Roosevelt to document what was happening in the country. And I believe they were picking peas to eat. You can see the children here, just covered in muck and dirt. And this, I know it's a little pixelated, but this right here is the same family as right here. And this is what they lived in. Shanty towns, as many lost their homes, they just set up little shacks, usually right on the outskirts or as close as they could to the cities where there were any kind of opportunities for any kind of work. And sometimes a lot of these were just outbuildings, siding that was used, just thrown up together for some type of shelter. It was really bad, guys. Also here again is another makeshift shelter with just looks like pieces of cloth and poles kind of holding everything up. Little kids right here. This one right here. You know, it's based on today's standards, it's amazing that so many survived. These guys don't even have shoes. There's no telling the last time they ate. All right, all standing in line trying to get a job, fill out an application. Surprised that 3 people had a job. And standing in line waiting to receive help. And you know, what's amazing about this, and what it really says about the American spirit, despite their social and economic circumstances, and all looking for jobs or help or food or whatever the situation is, they still have the presence to dress as nicely as they can with what they do have. And for many, what they have might be all they had left. Okay, and that's the conclusion of the Great Depression.